A silent alarm was triggered deep inside America's most secure nuclear facility, but no one knew why. One man saw the signs, but every step he took to stop it pulled him deeper into danger. Was it a glitch, or the start of something far more deadly? In the late 1970s, the world was holding its breath. The Cold War had seeped into every corner of life, from dinner table conversations to the quiet hum of top-secret laboratories. The tension between the United States and the Soviet Union was no longer just about politics or ideals. It was about survival, about who would blink first in a silent standoff surrounded by enough firepower to end the world many times over. It wasn't a war in the usual sense. There were no front lines to cross or battlegrounds to storm. Instead, the battlefield was invisible, hidden behind guarded fences, closed meeting rooms, and blinking control panels deep underground. And in places like the Pantex plant in the wide-open spaces of northern Texas, that invisible war felt more real than anywhere else. The Pantex plant was more than just a collection of concrete buildings surrounded by dirt roads and wind-blown fences. To those who worked there, it was a place of silence, protocol, and secrets. It was where nuclear warheads were assembled, disassembled, and maintained, a job that required exact precision and an unshakable sense of duty. And though most of the people who worked there were ordinary folks from nearby towns, what they were part of was anything but ordinary. Every day began the same way: security gates, ID checks, and long walks down quiet hallways lit by fluorescent bulbs. Employees were told only what they needed to know, and asking too many questions was a fast way to find yourself reassigned or under review. Cameras watched every hallway. Voices dropped when someone passed by. Even harmless chatter could feel like a risk. Fear didn't wear a uniform there. It wasn't loud. It was quiet and steady, like a low hum that never stopped. Everyone knew that a single mistake, a misplaced tool, an error in judgment, or a slip of the tongue could spark something none of them wanted to imagine. And so most kept their heads down, followed their routines, and never strayed beyond what was expected. But underneath that routine, something else had started to grow. Whispers, disappearances, records that didn't match. Some workers noticed changes they couldn't explain. Strange maintenance calls, familiar faces transferred without warning, and warnings passed in hushed voices that left more questions than answers. No one said it out loud, but the feeling was unmistakable. Something was wrong. The Cold War didn't just create fear of the enemy abroad. It created suspicion at home. It turned allies into watchmen and neighbors into possible threats. And inside Pantex, that suspicion ran deep. Some believed spies had found a way in. Others whispered about internal sabotage, not from outside but from within their own chain of command. But no one dared confront it directly, because if you were wrong, your career and maybe your safety could be taken away just as easily as your clearance badge. It was in this thick atmosphere of tension and secrecy that Thomas Harlan showed up for work each day. Harlan was not the kind of man to draw attention to himself. In his late 20s, quiet, steady-handed, and deeply focused, he worked in systems diagnostics, one of the many roles that rarely made headlines, but quietly ensured everything ran the way it should. Harlan had been stationed at Pantex for almost 3 years. Before that, he had served in communications repair overseas and had returned with a more serious gaze than when he left. There was something careful about the way he moved, like every step had to be earned. He didn't talk much, and when he did, it was only after thinking things through. What separated Harlan from the others wasn't his skill, though he was sharp, or his loyalty, though he had plenty. It was his habit of noticing small things. A sensor that gave the wrong signal, a wire that didn't belong, a routine test that suddenly got postponed without explanation. Things most others might ignore, Harlan logged, cross-checked, and questioned. It had earned him a few quiet warnings from supervisors, reminders to stay in his lane and let the upper levels worry about anomalies. But even Harlan knew when to hold back. The culture at Pantex was not forgiving. Reporting the wrong thing to the wrong person could get you labeled as trouble. And once you had that label, it stuck. So he played it smart. He stayed quiet, observed, and waited. Still, something deep inside him was beginning to stir, a feeling that whatever was going on wasn't just an oversight or miscommunication. It felt deliberate, coordinated. Outside the facility, the world kept turning. Politicians gave speeches, News anchors recited daily threats and warnings, and children in school practiced drills under their desks, as if crouching low could protect them from the unimaginable. But inside Pantex, a different kind of drill was underway, one that involved careful planning, hidden motives, and a risk so great it didn't just threaten one town or city, it threatened everyone. And though no one yet knew it, that quiet systems technician, the one who rarely spoke up and always kept to himself, was about to step into something far bigger than he'd ever imagined. Something that would test not only his skills but his courage, judgment, and resolve. Because in a place built on silence, one voice choosing to speak could change everything. Thomas Harlan had never been the kind of man who needed recognition. Even before he wore a uniform, before the war, before the long nights spent adjusting circuits and troubleshooting control panels, he was quiet, focused. He kept to himself, not because he was shy, but because he believed words mattered, and if they didn't serve a purpose, he saw no reason to waste them. At 28, he looked older than his age, not in the lines of his face, though those were there too, but in the stillness of his eyes. He carried something behind them that didn't fade with time. Most people just called it experience, the kind that came from seeing too much, too young. But it was more than that. It was the weight of remembering things he couldn't forget, and knowing he could never explain them to someone who hadn't been there. Thomas had served in Southeast Asia during the war, not on the front lines but close enough to hear the engines at night and feel the ground shake from nearby airfields. He'd worked in communications then, field repairs, tracking failures, keeping radios alive in conditions no textbook had prepared him for. It was dirty work, frustrating at times, but he never complained. It kept others safe, that was enough. When he came home, he didn't celebrate like others. He packed his duffel, took a long bus ride from the coast, and slipped quietly into civilian life. The war had changed him, but not in the way people expected. It hadn't made him cold. It had made him careful. He'd seen what happened when people trusted systems blindly, when they followed orders without understanding the weight behind them. So when he was offered a post at the Pantex plant in Texas, one of the most sensitive nuclear facilities in the country, he took it with quiet resolve. He saw it as a duty, not a job. At first his work spoke for itself. He advanced quickly, gaining clearance that gave him access to core systems and diagnostic logs few ever saw. Supervisors noted his attention to detail, his ability to spot issues that others missed, and his unwavering discipline. But over time that same habit of questioning, of double-checking things that didn't add up, started to draw the wrong kind of attention. 6 months before the current events began, Thomas had been pulled into a closed-door meeting. No warning, just a short note slipped under his office door asking him to report to a room he didn't usually enter. Inside were 2 senior officials he didn't know well, both with unreadable faces and short tempers. They asked him why he had flagged a routine access pattern on one of the internal systems. He explained, calmly, that the log showed activity during hours when no technician had clearance to be on that level. It could have been an error, yes, but he felt it needed to be reviewed. Instead of appreciation, he received silence, then a warning. 2 weeks later, his clearance was downgraded. No explanation. His schedule was changed without notice. His desk moved to a less secure section of the plant. A month after that, his supervisor, someone he'd worked with since day one, was suddenly transferred. The replacement didn't speak much but always seemed to be watching. It didn't take Thomas long to understand what was happening. He was being watched too, not officially, not with written orders, but in subtle ways. Random inspections of his locker, notes missing from his files, co-workers hesitant to speak around him. Even the coffee breaks became colder. Some would have taken the hint and requested a transfer. Others might have walked away completely, choosing a quieter life in a smaller town. But not Thomas. He stayed. Not out of pride, he didn't care about position or rank, but because something didn't feel right. The same instincts that kept him alive overseas were now whispering the same warning. Something dangerous was moving just beneath the surface. Despite the pressure, he kept a journal. Not the kind with secrets or classified notes, but his personal log, dates, times, inconsistencies, things he could cross-reference later. It was how he stayed sharp, how he kept from losing focus in a place that wanted him to forget what he knew. There were others he trusted once, but most were gone now, some reassigned, others suddenly distant. It was as if the people who had respected him a year ago had been told to stay away, or maybe they'd chosen it themselves. Either way, the message was clear: he was on his own. What made it harder was that Thomas didn't know who to trust anymore. It wasn't just about catching someone doing the wrong thing, it was about proving it without ending up labeled the problem himself. And with his access limited, it meant relying on his memory, his notes and patterns only he seemed to notice. He felt the isolation, but he never showed it. He went about his work with the same steady routine, arriving early, leaving late, and always observing. It was a strange kind of calm, like being in the eye of a storm you knew was coming, but couldn't see yet. And then, one morning, something shifted. It started small. A technician he barely knew passed him in the hallway and offered a silent nod, the kind of look that meant more than words. That same day, a report landed on his desk showing unexpected system activity in a part of the plant that had supposedly been shut down for scheduled repairs. The entry logs didn't match. The equipment inventory was off by two missing components in a facility where every screw was counted. Thomas didn't panic. He didn't report it yet either. He just circled the numbers and added a new page to his journal. He'd learned long ago that sometimes the most dangerous things were not the ones that shouted, but the ones that whispered. And now, the whispers were getting louder. Thomas Harlan had always believed that the smallest details could reveal the biggest truths. So when he saw the irregularities for the first time, he didn't sound an alarm. He just watched. It began with something small, an internal log entry that didn't make sense. A systems test was logged for a section of the facility that had been shut down that week for upgrades. The report said it was a maintenance test, but the entry had no technician's name attached to it, no shift date, just a blank space where a signature should have been. Thomas didn't react. He made a note in his journal, cross-checked the backup logs, and moved on. But a pattern began to form. A week later, he noticed a cooling system test had been overridden. It was connected to a sealed warhead unit, one that wasn't scheduled for any work for another 2 months. The system had flagged it as an error, calling it a sensor fault. But Thomas knew the difference between a glitch and a manual override. He had designed similar systems overseas during his time in Vietnam. This wasn't random. Someone had accessed the cooling system remotely, bypassed the safety alert, and left no trace of who had done it. When he brought it up to his supervisor, the conversation was short. "It's been handled," the man said, flipping through a stack of unrelated files. "Probably a software hiccup. Happens sometimes. No need to dig too deep." But Thomas had already dug deep. The cooling system was tied directly to temperature regulation inside the core. A failure could lead to internal damage, or worse, he couldn't ignore it. That night, as he sat in his small room, reviewing his notes, there was a knock on the door. Not loud, not hurried, just firm. When he opened it, he found a man he recognized but didn't know well. His name was Aaron Maddox, a systems analyst assigned only 3 months ago. Aaron always kept his head down, worked quietly, and rarely joined the others in the break room. "I shouldn't stay long," Aaron said, glancing down the hallway, "but I saw the same logs. I think it's bigger than just one error." Thomas stepped aside, letting him in without saying a word. Inside, Aaron spoke in a low voice. "There have been other overrides, not just on cooling, pressure monitors, valve timers. Some of them were reversed before anyone noticed, but others stayed that way for days. When I flagged them in the system, my access was locked the next morning." Thomas listened closely. This was the first time anyone had confirmed what he'd suspected. Someone inside the facility was deliberately tampering with core systems. "I tried to print the logs," Aaron said. "They vanished. Even the printer history was erased." Thomas took a breath, trying to hide the churn in his chest. "Why come to me?" "Because you were the only one who didn't look the other way when it happened. They've pushed you to the edges, just like they're trying to do to me." Aaron stood to leave, then paused at the door. "I'm not sure how far this goes, but it's not just sloppy work. Someone's testing limits, seeing how far they can push without being caught." And then, he left. The next morning, Aaron Maddox didn't show up for work. His name was wiped from the internal staff roster by lunchtime. When Thomas asked about him casually at the water cooler, someone told him Aaron had taken a new job up north, but no one had seen him pack his things. His locker was emptied out before the end of the day. Thomas didn't need proof to know what had happened. Aaron had been silenced, not in any extreme way, but removed, erased, replaced. That kind of quiet disappearance didn't happen by accident. With no one else to turn to, Thomas decided to bring the issue to the highest level he could. He scheduled a meeting with the facility's operations manager, a man named Charles Whitmore. Whitmore was known for being sharp and impatient, the kind of leader who made decisions fast and didn't tolerate gray areas. Thomas walked into the meeting with printed reports, handwritten notes and backup scans of the anomalies. He laid them out one by one, explaining how the overrides had been carefully masked, how logs were vanishing, and how the systems were being manipulated in ways that posed serious danger to the warheads stored on site. Whitmore didn't even look at the documents. Instead, he leaned back in his chair and folded his arms. "You were warned once before, Harlan, about pushing narratives that disrupt the work environment." Thomas's chest tightened. "This isn't about disruption. It's about safety. You saw what happened to Aaron." "Enough," Whitmore interrupted. "You're a technician, not an investigator. You're here to follow procedures, not invent stories. If I hear about this again, you'll be recommended for termination. No severance, no appeal." The meeting was over before it had truly begun. As Thomas walked back through the long corridors of the facility, a cold truth settled in. The threat wasn't just from outside. It wasn't some foreign spy or enemy force. It was someone inside the fence line. Someone with access, patience, and protection. He passed the break room and caught a few familiar faces turning away as he walked by. The isolation was becoming permanent now. The walls were closing in, and every step he took was being watched. Still, he couldn't stop. That night, Thomas didn't go home. Instead, he found a quiet corner in a low-traffic part of the facility, a small locked cabinet room used for outdated tools and backup wires. There, under a dim ceiling light, he began rebuilding everything from memory. The override sequences, the missing logs, the security schedule gaps, and the sudden movements of sensitive equipment. Every fact led back to one idea. Someone was trying to create the appearance of minor glitches while pushing key systems to the edge. But why? For distraction? Or for something much worse? Thomas didn't know the full picture yet, but he knew one thing with certainty. If the pattern continued, the next move might not be reversible. Thomas Harlan had always believed that doing the right thing would bring clarity, but in the days that followed his failed meeting with Charles Whitmore, clarity was the one thing he no longer had. Every hallway in the facility now felt longer, colder. Conversation stopped when he approached. Doors closed a little faster. People who once nodded in passing avoided eye contact altogether. The walls of silence were closing in on him. He wasn't formally punished. Not yet, but subtle things started happening. His toolbox, the one he had kept organized for years, was misplaced. When it reappeared, 2 important calibration devices were missing. His locker was found open one evening. Even though he remembered locking it, he asked about it, only to be told he must have forgotten. He hadn't. The following morning, he noticed a small crack in his car's side mirror. Later that week, the steering felt off during his drive home, almost like someone had loosened something beneath the car. He took it to a mechanic in Amarillo, who confirmed the bolts connecting the steering column had been disturbed. The mechanic looked concerned. "You hit a pothole, or did someone mess with it?" Thomas didn't answer. Back at the Pantex facility, routine had turned into surveillance. Random security checks began, once, then twice, then nearly every day. His name was called over the intercom for equipment inspections he hadn't requested. Someone was tracking his movements, not just during work hours but well beyond them. At first he told himself it was coincidence. Then, he stopped believing that. By the end of the week he began recording audio notes at night. Using an old tape recorder he kept from his time in the army, he didn't speak like he was making a journal. He spoke like he was leaving evidence. "If anything happens to me," he whispered into the recorder one night, "it's not a mistake. I'm not unstable. I'm not careless. I've found something, and someone wants it buried." He paused, then clicked the stop button. This wasn't about recognition anymore. It was about survival. But survival meant choosing between 2 impossible paths. Stay quiet and watch something terrible unfold, or keep pushing forward and risk being erased, just like Aaron Maddox. Thomas thought about Aaron every night now. No one even brought up his name anymore. It was like he'd never existed. The hardest part, though, wasn't the fear. It was the doubt. What if he was wrong? What if it really was just a pile of harmless glitches and strange coincidences? What if all of this, the missing logs, the overrides, the whispered warning, had been misread through the lens of paranoia? But then he would remember the warhead cooling unit. He had worked on that system himself. The override had to be intentional. That memory always pulled him back from the edge of doubt. Still, the weight of it all was building. The long hours, the whispered rumors, the growing distance between him and everyone else, it took a toll. One afternoon, while reviewing system data alone in one of the secondary control rooms, Thomas heard the faint hum of footsteps outside the door. He turned, expecting a coworker. No one entered. The footsteps faded. He waited another few seconds before stepping out to look. The hallway was empty. No sounds, no movement. That night he dreamed of a warhead casing, glowing red. In the dream he was trying to warn someone, but no words came out. He woke up sweating. The image still burned in his mind. He didn't tell anyone. Instead, he spent his lunch breaks in his car, parked at the far edge of the facility lot. He no longer used the break room. Too many eyes, too many unfinished conversations that stopped the moment he entered. He tried calling a former colleague in Washington, someone he trusted, but the call didn't go through. The line buzzed twice, then dropped. When he tried again later, he got a strange message. This number is not accepting incoming calls. That evening, he found a note stuck to his windshield. It was just a printed line of numbers, coordinates, no name, no message, no explanation. He didn't recognize the format, but he kept the note. The following morning, his ID badge failed at the security gate. The guard didn't say much, just that it must be a technical error. He was let through after a manual override, but the message was clear: his access was being chipped away. Inside, Thomas noticed that someone else had been assigned to one of the control stations he used to monitor. No one said it out loud, but it was obvious. They were closing in on him step by step, without ever officially filing a report. Still, he came in every day. He took notes, he smiled when needed, and every night he recorded another tape. "This isn't about pride," he said softly into the recorder. "It's about doing what's right, even if it means you stand alone." His voice cracked a little. He let the silence stretch before switching it off. By now he had accepted that he wasn't just dealing with mistakes. Someone powerful was moving pieces inside the facility. Someone who knew exactly how to break a man down without ever raising a hand. But he wasn't broken yet. He just needed one more piece. One more answer. One more thread to follow. And he had a feeling it was close. It happened late one evening, just as Thomas Harlan was ready to stop chasing shadows. He had spent the day skimming through old diagnostic reports, internal shift schedules, and a stack of security logs he'd quietly saved over the past 3 weeks. Most of it was routine, the kind of monotonous entries meant to numb the brain into giving up. He was about to pack it in, when he found a file labeled Archived Surveillance Maintenance Annex C. It wasn't flagged, it wasn't hidden, just buried under layers of bureaucracy that no one bothered to check. Curious, he ran the video feed. At first, it was grainy hallway footage, empty corridors, one janitor, a technician with a clipboard, the usual. Then the timestamp shifted. The camera angle jumped to a hallway outside a restricted sublevel, one that housed the facility's environmental control systems, essential to regulating the core temperatures of several warhead units under maintenance. 2 figures appeared. Thomas leaned forward. They weren't the maintenance staff, and they weren't scheduled to be there at that hour. The first man, taller and confident, was unmistakable. Deputy Director Carlton Rhodes. He was well known around the site, a man who earned both trust and authority with quiet professionalism. The second man, partially obscured, took Thomas a few seconds to identify. It was Major Louis Benning, someone who had always kept a low profile but carried decades of technical experience. Neither of them had clearance for that room, not at that hour, and certainly not without an escort. And yet, there they were, walking in. No hesitation. Thomas froze the screen. For a moment he couldn't breathe. He knew Carlton Rhodes. Everyone did. He was the type of leader people didn't question, mostly because they never had a reason to. And yet here he was, walking casually into a space only a few top-level engineers should access. Well, after all standard checks had ended. It wasn't just suspicious, it was deliberate. He rewound and played it again. Same movements, same quiet entry. He clicked through more footage, searching surrounding hours. Eventually he spotted another anomaly, A remote override initiated from an unregistered console at the exact time the two men were seen entering the restricted zone. That override had temporarily disabled part of the cooling sequence in one of the holding bays. On the surface, it looked like a temporary test cycle. But Thomas had seen that exact bay marked earlier in the week flagged for unexpected fluctuations. He opened a separate file. Digging further, he unearthed maintenance logs signed off by Benning, logs that listed work which, upon closer inspection, hadn't actually been completed. Thomas sat back in his chair. This wasn't carelessness. It was a pattern. A coordinated one. His hands trembled slightly as he reached for his notebook. He flipped through pages of scribbled dates, numbers, comments. It all pointed in the same direction. These anomalies weren't random. They were orchestrated, a string of quiet sabotages building towards something big. Still, he didn't want to believe it. The final piece came through a sealed email thread Thomas accessed using an old admin login he'd kept after his demotion. It was likely supposed to be deleted, but someone hadn't cleared the digital trash bin. It was a short message exchange between Benning and someone identified only as WM. The language was cautious, filled with vague terms, but one line stood out. Final sequence initiates within 48 hours, must align with inspection team arrival. Any deviation draws attention. Cold trigger must appear accidental. Thomas stared at the screen. 48 hours. 2 days. That was when the International Arms Treaty Inspection Team was scheduled to arrive at Pantex. The visit was supposed to be a formality, a gesture of goodwill as the U.S. and several other nations moved closer to signing a global arms reduction agreement. But now, he understood the real plan. The fail-safe cooling system had been slowly destabilized. The backup protocols were being rerouted, and the idea wasn't to destroy, not completely, but to create a meltdown just contained enough to suggest a catastrophic failure of internal controls. If successful, it would call the entire American nuclear safety program into question. The treaty would fall apart, the public would panic, trust in the government would collapse, and worst of all, it would look like no one was to blame. Thomas suddenly saw it clearly. These weren't foreign agents. They weren't saboteurs from across the ocean. They were Americans, insiders who had lost faith in the very system they once served. He remembered something Whitmore once told him in passing: the real danger isn't always outside the fence. Sometimes, it's the people who help build it. Now it made sense. Rhodes and Benning weren't trying to harm the country, not in their own eyes. They believed they were protecting it. By staging a crisis, they thought they could force transparency, bring change, maybe even prevent future war. But their method, their timing, it would set the world on fire. Thomas leaned back, his mind spinning. How many others were involved? Who was WM? Was this just happening at Pantex, or across other facilities too? He didn't have those answers, but he didn't need them. He had proof, enough to act. The question was how. He couldn't go to internal security. Rhodes had reached, so did Benning. Every department was tied into theirs. If he went through official channels, the evidence would vanish, and he might vanish with it. His only option was to find someone outside the immediate chain of command. Someone with reach, but not aligned with the day-to-day leadership of the site. Then he remembered a name: Eleanor Stack, a Department of Energy investigator who had once overseen nuclear compliance during the late audits. She had visited the site months ago. Professional, distant, but honest. If he could get the information to her, quietly, without tipping anyone off, there might still be time. But the clock was now ticking. 48 hours. And Thomas Harlan was now the only person standing between a secret operation and a global diplomatic disaster. Thomas Harlan had always worked alone, not because he wanted to, but because trusting the wrong person in a place like Pantex could end everything. But now he needed help, real help. Time was running short, and there were layers of access even he couldn't reach on his own. He found himself pacing in the corner of the electronics lab, long after most of the staff had gone home. The only sound was the faint hum of cooling fans and the occasional pop of static from an old monitor across the room. That's when his eyes landed on someone sitting alone at the far end of the lab: Javier Ortega. Javier was young, maybe 26, quiet, always buried in schematics or toolkits. He kept to himself, but Thomas had watched him over the months. Javier never cut corners. He asked the right questions, and sometimes, too many of them, just like Thomas once did. It was a risk, but Thomas was out of options. He approached cautiously. Ortega, he said, lowering his voice, I need your help, right now. It's about the control bay under Annex C. Javier looked up, confused. What do you mean? I haven't worked down there in weeks. Thomas leaned closer. Something's wrong with the cooling systems. Someone's rigged them to fail, and it's tied to the upcoming inspection. Javier's eyes widened. You're joking, right? I wish I was. He pulled out the folder he had kept hidden in his locker. Printouts, copied video stills, partial logs, enough to paint a blurry but frightening picture. Javier scanned the pages, his hand beginning to tremble. This can't be real. It is. I've traced overrides back to Rhodes and Benning. I don't think they're working alone. Javier looked around nervously. If they find us talking about this, we're finished. Thomas nodded. That's why I'm not asking you to blow the whistle. Just help me confirm one thing. There's a hidden control panel in sublevel 3, near the failsafe bay. I need your access codes to reach it. Javier hesitated. That's off limits. I could lose my clearance. I know, Thomas interrupted gently. But if we don't act, the whole facility could be shut down under scandal, or worse. The silence stretched. Then slowly, Javier nodded. Together they made their way down to the lower levels using a service elevator, avoiding main halls and visible checkpoints. Thomas could feel the weight of the walls closing in. Cameras followed them silently, but he had already chosen a time when the surveillance feeds were typically reviewed later, in batches. If they moved fast, they'd stay hidden. For now, they reached the steel door near the far end of sublevel 3. The hallway was dim and quiet. Javier reached into his pocket, hands slightly shaking, and entered a string of keys into the wall panel. There was a soft click. The door opened. Inside, the air was warm and dry, filled with the low whir of machinery. Dozens of panels lined the wall, most of them blinking green, but 2 small indicators glowed amber. Javier walked over and studied the screen. Look here, he whispered. Cooling Unit 5. It's been running outside standard parameters for over 72 hours. But the system isn't flagging it. Someone changed the alerts. Thomas leaned in. Can you override it? Reset the backup? Javier nodded slowly. I think so, but it has to be done manually. It's not just software. Someone's pulled physical relays from the maintenance shaft above the bay. They wanted to make it look like a mechanical issue. Thomas sighed. Then we go up there. Now. But as they turned, they heard it. Footsteps echoing down the hallway. Not hurried, just steady. Someone was coming. Thomas motioned silently to Javier, and the two slipped behind a narrow support beam near the back of the room. The footsteps passed, followed by the low mumble of voices. They heard someone pause just outside the door. Keys jingled. Thomas clenched his jaw. Then the door clicked again, and shut. Silence returned. Javier exhaled. That was too close. Yeah, Thomas said, steadying his breath. We don't have much time. They made their way to the upper access tunnel where the manual relays were located. Javier climbed first, flashlight between his teeth, pulling open a narrow panel overhead. What he found inside confirmed everything. Wires had been cut and rerouted, backup systems disabled. The failsafe timers had been altered just enough to seem like an equipment failure, a failure that would trigger during the inspection tour. Javier reached into his kit, grabbing insulated clamps. I can bypass this. Give me 5 minutes. Thomas kept watch, heart pounding. Every minute they spent there increased the chance of being discovered. But then, just as Javier reconnected the first set of wires, a bright light flashed behind them. Freeze. 2 guards stood at the tunnel entrance. Thomas turned to Javier. Don't say a word. The guards didn't shout. They didn't explain. They simply grabbed Javier by the arm and motioned for Thomas to stay put. He's coming with us. Thomas didn't resist. Any sudden movement would only make things worse. But as they took Javier away, the younger man turned once to look back at Thomas, eyes wide, frightened, but silent. Thomas didn't know if that was good or bad. He spent the next hour hiding in the duct system, crawling from one end of the sublevel to the other. His clothes were soaked with sweat, his throat dry, but his mind was clear. He now had 2 enemies, the ones running the sabotage, and time. If Javier talked, even under pressure, Thomas would be next. But a part of him hoped Javier would hold out. He had seen the truth, felt it. Still, hope wasn't a plan. Thomas needed a new way in, a new route to access the final controls, the ones that could fully stop the shutdown sequence. There was one last access port, It was located inside the server room directly beneath the operations deck, and it could only be opened from inside, which meant Thomas would have to bluff his way through 2 checkpoints, sneak past at least 1 security station, and hope that no one recognized his name as flagged. It was madness, but so was doing nothing. As he climbed back into a maintenance stairwell and shut the panel behind him, Thomas reached into his jacket and pulled out his small notepad. He flipped to a fresh page and started to write. "If I don't make it, someone has to finish this. I wasn't crazy, I was right, it's real." He folded the note, placed it inside his watch casing, and closed the latch. Then he tightened his boots, wiped his hands and stepped back into the hallway. He was alone now, and the next few hours would decide everything. The storm rolled in just past midnight. Thick clouds stretched over the Texas plains, smothering the sky and swallowing the stars. Rain pelted the roof of the Pentex plant like it was trying to punch through steel. It was the kind of storm the facility's emergency team called a perfect systems test. Backup generators were already humming, power lines swaying in the wind. It was also the perfect cover. Inside the facility, the storm had triggered a scheduled power reroute, a safety protocol that temporarily shifted key systems to backup circuits. For most it was routine, but for Thomas Harlan it was the final window. He moved silently through the lower corridors, his ID badge clipped upside down, just like the repair crew had always done to avoid scanners during manual inspections, a trick he'd picked up during his earliest months. With Ortega gone, taken, questioned, maybe worse, Harlan was alone. The sabotage timeline had less than 2 hours remaining, and the fail-safe panel that needed overriding was inside the control sector, under full lockdown. Unless there was a storm. Now half the facility was running on secondary power, which meant door locks were on time cycles. Every 3 minutes a new circuit opened for just 6 seconds, enough for someone who knew where to be and when. Harlan pressed his ear to the cold metal door of Sector 4C. He heard nothing. He waited. The light above the keypad flickered once, green. He moved. Through the door and down the narrow hallway, his boots patted softly on the concrete. At the far end stood the control chamber, a room filled with monitors, analog dials and access terminals that hadn't been updated in years. The core control panel was in there, and so was the final override switch that could stop the sabotage sequence. But Harlan wasn't alone. He heard a voice. Low, calm. Too calm. "You always were too smart for your own good." Harlan froze. Out from the shadows stepped Colonel Everett Bryant, tall, composed. His face showed no panic, no rage, just a quiet, steady disappointment, like a man whose plans had been disturbed but not destroyed. "I hoped you'd keep your head down," Bryant said, "but I guess you've always had this flaw, a habit of seeing too much." Harlan stepped closer, carefully. "You built all this, didn't you? The cooling failure, the relay bypasses, the timing, with the inspection, all of it." Bryant didn't deny it. He walked slowly toward the main terminal, his hands visible but relaxed. "I had help, men who served with honor, men who saw the truth. You think this is betrayal, but it's not. This is clarity." Harlan's voice was low. "You were going to let them think it was an accident. Let the world believe American carelessness brought us inches from disaster." Bryant nodded once. "Exactly. And it would have worked. Imagine the headlines, the horror, the panic. People would have demanded change, forced talks, disarmament, real peace." "Peace through fear?" Harlan's voice cracked slightly. "That's not peace. That's a trick, a lie." Bryant's expression shifted. His eyes hardened. "You think anything else will work? How many treaties have been broken? How many talks ended in more testing? The only way to stop this madness is to let the world look over the edge." He turned and began typing on the terminal. "The sequence is locked. The core process starts in less than 6 minutes. You can't stop it now." But Harlan was already moving. He stepped behind the central console, fingers flying across the analog input board. His hands knew the system better than Bryant did. His training wasn't for sabotage, but for integrity, and that mattered now. He scanned lines of code, checking each input. His heart pounded. The manual override was still reachable, but the access path had been scrambled. He needed a key sequence. And then he remembered. The test pattern Ortega had scribbled into the margin of a diagnostic form 3 nights ago. A string of numbers based on pulse intervals. He keyed it in. Denied. "Try again." Bryant moved closer. "You don't have clearance anymore, Harlan. You're not even supposed to be here. I don't need clearance to protect the people you swore to serve, he snapped. Second attempt. The terminal beeped. Access granted. But Bryant lunged. They collided with the side of the console, monitors wobbling. Bryant's elbow slammed into Harlan's side, sending him reeling. They struggled, both trying to reach the controls. Bryant was stronger. Years of command didn't make him slow. But Harlan was faster. He twisted away, rolled to the floor and grabbed a nearby tool, not to strike, just to press the emergency switch mounted behind the panel. With one motion he jammed it into place. Everything stopped. The lights flickered. Fans halted. The countdown froze on screen with just under 3 minutes left. Harlan collapsed against the wall, chest heaving. He felt a strange stillness settle over the room. The storm outside rumbled, but inside, silent. Bryant stared at the screen. It's done, Harlan said quietly. You're finished. But Bryant wasn't looking at him. He was scanning the monitors, eyes flicking rapidly. Then, without a word, he turned and sprinted toward the maintenance hatch behind the fuel regulator chamber. Bryant. But the hatch slammed shut before Harlan could follow. He ran to it, tried the latch, locked from the other side. Bryant was gone. By the time security arrived, Harlan had restored system integrity and printed a full readout of the sabotage pattern. He handed it to the incoming safety officer with shaking hands. I suggest you check the relay logs from 3 weeks ago, he said. Start with sub-level 3. The officer, stunned, barely nodded. Harlan gave no further explanation. He knew what would come next. Reports, investigations, quiet interviews in windowless rooms. They would piece it together or pretend they hadn't seen it. Bryant's name might never be spoken aloud. The government wouldn't want it public. A decorated officer, vanishing hours before a sabotage attempt. It would raise questions no one wanted to answer. But somewhere, Harlan knew, Bryant was still out there, watching, waiting, believing he had done the right thing. 2 days later, as cleanup crews swept through the affected areas and system analysts double-checked the damage, Harlan sat alone in his small quarters. He opened his notebook, the same one where he had written everything in case he didn't make it. He turned to a blank page and wrote slowly. I stopped a disaster, but I couldn't stop him. Peace doesn't come through shadows or silence. It comes through truth. He closed the book and placed it in the bottom drawer of his desk. Then he stood, walked to the window, and looked out over the dry Texas plains. The storm had passed. The clouds had moved on. The facility looked the same. Calm, normal, but nothing felt the same. And Thomas Harlan knew this. The real war wasn't just between nations. It was inside the hearts of men. The report was filed under System Diagnostics Review Contingency Week. It ran 54 pages long. None of it mentioned sabotage. The official summary stated that during a storm-induced power reroute, a previously undetected software anomaly was corrected. Before it could trigger any operational concern, safety systems had performed as expected. There were no names mentioned, no blame assigned, and certainly no suggestions of intent behind the anomaly. It was signed by 3 officers, one of whom had been on scheduled leave the entire week. Thomas Harlan read the report just once, sitting across from a quiet man in a suit who delivered it in a sealed envelope. The man gave no opinion, offered no comfort. He simply passed it over, stood, and walked away. A week later, Harlan was processed out of the facility. The papers called it a medical separation. No mention of his demotion, no note on what he had uncovered. A vague reference to exhaustion was all that remained in his personnel file. His badge was revoked. His access card was deactivated. His locker was emptied before he arrived. There was no ceremony, no handshake, no farewell. Javier Ortega's name never appeared in any document. He had simply disappeared. When Harlan asked one of the lower-level technicians if they'd heard anything, the answer came with a nervous glance around the hallway. He must have taken a job somewhere else. That's what people do, right? Right. By the time Harlan returned home to a small town tucked between dry hills and sleeping highways, the world had already moved on. The newspaper on his porch spoke of a new international inspection agreement and praised recent safety measures adopted by domestic nuclear sites. No mention of Texas. No mention of the Pantex plant. No mention of what almost happened. His neighbor, Mrs. Calhoun, waved when she saw him, then added with a polite smile, "You're home early. Did the contract end?" He nodded, quietly. She brought over a pie later that evening. He thanked her, set it on the counter, and didn't touch it for days. The house was too quiet. Every sound, a distant truck, the creak of the floorboards made his shoulders tense. Every knock on the door made him pause. At night he sat by the window, curtains slightly open, watching nothing in particular. He tried the television, but everything felt unreal. Sitcoms with fake laughter, interviews with clean-cut hosts, news segments filled with smiles. They had no idea, and maybe that was the point. He took long walks down the dirt road behind his property, where the wind stirred old leaves and dry brush. The silence there was different. Honest. It didn't try to hide anything. He kept the notebook, the one he had filled with recordings and observations and fears. He didn't destroy it, but he didn't share it either. It lived in the same drawer as his old service patches, and a photograph of his squad from a lifetime ago. Sometimes, he opened it. Sometimes he just sat with it in his hands. One afternoon, weeks after the incident, he received a letter with no return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper, typed, clean. It mattered. Some of us know what you did. Stay quiet, stay safe. That was all. He burned the envelope in the fire pit out back. Over time the days became more regular. He repaired an old radio, fixed the shed roof, started a garden. He taught himself to cook simple meals, though he still forgot to buy salt half the time. No one asked about the facility. No one asked about Ortega. And no one ever asked if he'd saved anyone. But sometimes he would sit outside in the evening, looking at the horizon as the sky turned gold. The hum of distant power lines buzzed faintly in the air. A plane crossed overhead too high to hear, and he would think, I did the right thing. Even if the world never knew, even if no one said thank you. Even if the truth had been locked away behind thick walls and false words, he had done the right thing. Years later someone would mention the Texas facility again, a news report, a retrospective, a historian's commentary on Cold War precautions. They'd speak in polished language about engineering marvels and airtight protocols, maybe even quote anonymous sources about a near miss that never quite reached the public eye. And somewhere, far from the lights and cameras, Thomas Harlan would listen with quiet eyes and no expression. He wouldn't speak. He wouldn't correct them. But deep inside, in a place untouched by lies or edits, he would remember the storm, the countdown, the truth, and the choice he made alone, not for reward, not for recognition, but because someone had to. Because if no one stopped it, everything would have been lost. And that was enough. Decades had passed. The Cold War was no longer a shadow hanging over the world, but a chapter in dusty history books. The massive nuclear arsenals that once seemed untouchable were reduced by treaties and cautious diplomacy. Yet, many stories from those tense days remained locked behind layers of secrecy, forgotten or deliberately hidden. Thomas Harlan had long since retired from any connection to the military or government. He lived quietly, away from the public eye, in a small town where the world knew him as just a retired technician, with a gentle smile and a garden that bloomed in defiance of the desert air. His hair had turned silver, his face carried the lines of a lifetime's worries, and his eyes still held that quiet alertness, the kind earned by a man who had seen what few others did. One day, a knock came at his door. The visitor was a woman, in her mid-30s with sharp eyes, and a camera slung over her shoulder. She introduced herself as Rachel Monroe, an investigative journalist working on a documentary about nuclear safety during the Cold War. Rachel had been chasing leads for months, sifting through declassified files, government archives, and faded photographs. Somewhere deep in a forgotten vault she had found records referencing an incident at the Pantex plant, a name linked only to a shadowy footnote in history. Her questions were precise, respectful, but unyielding. Mr. Harlan, she said, holding out a hand, I believe you're the only person who can tell what really happened. Harlan hesitated. The years had taught him the cost of truth. But Rachel's eyes were steady. There was no hunger for fame, no eagerness to sensationalize, just a sincere search for answers. After long moments, he nodded. He agreed to meet her, on the condition that he would tell his story in his own words, on his own terms, and without public fanfare. The interviews took place in his modest living room. The camera was set up simply a single chair, soft light filtering through a window, the hum of everyday life outside. He spoke slowly at first, the memory still raw despite the years. He told Rachel about the paranoia inside the facility, the silence that wasn't silence, the fear that never fully left the walls. He described the anomalies he had uncovered, the threats whispered behind closed doors, and the friend he had lost along the way, Javier Ortega, whose fate remained a painful mystery. When Rachel asked about Colonel Bryant, his voice grew colder. "He vanished into the shadows," Harlan said. "No one ever held him accountable, and maybe that was part of the plan, to hide the truth deep enough that no one could find it." But what mattered most to Harlan was not the villains or the politics. It was the choice he made, standing alone when everything told him to stay silent. "I didn't do it for medals," he said. "I did it because someone had to. Because if I didn't, the consequences would have been unimaginable." Rachel listened, her notebook filling with words that would soon bring light to a story the world had forgotten. The interview was long, sometimes difficult, but it ended with a quiet handshake. Harlan did not seek recognition. He only wished for the truth to be known, not to glorify himself but to remind people of the real dangers lurking beneath the surface of power. When the documentary aired months later, it sparked a quiet conversation. Experts discussed the risks that nuclear programs always carry, the human element that technology cannot replace, and the silent sacrifices of those who work in the shadows to prevent disaster. The film did not name Harlan a hero, nor did it single out specific names in sensational headlines. Instead, it honored a generation of men and women, technicians, scientists, and soldiers, whose stories had long been buried. At the end of the program, a simple text appeared on the screen. "The greatest threats often come not from outside enemies but from within. This is the story of one man's courage, and the untold stories of those who quietly kept us safe." Harlan watched from his living room, a small smile touching his lips. He felt no pride, just relief. Relief that after all these years the truth was finally out. Relief that the shadows no longer held the whole story. And relief that even in silence his choice had mattered. The Cold War might have faded, but the lessons remained. And in the quiet corners of history, the bravery of one man echoed like a whisper, a reminder that sometimes the greatest battles are fought in secret, and the greatest victories never seek applause. As the interview ended, and the documentary found its place in the world, Thomas Harlan felt a weight lift from his shoulders. For so many years he had carried the burden of secrecy and silence, the knowledge that the greatest danger had come not from an enemy across the ocean, but from within his own ranks. The Cold War had been a time when fear ran deep, and trust was fragile. Governments built vast arsenals capable of ending the world many times over, believing that might would keep peace. But the real risk, as Harlan had lived and learned, was betrayal from the inside, when those sworn to protect begin to question the very purpose of what they guard, and sometimes lose their way. Walking slowly through a quiet town, Thomas found himself near a nuclear weapons site, now heavily guarded but no longer shrouded in the mystery it once carried. Outside the gates, a small group of protesters gathered, young and old, voices raised in peaceful defiance, demanding disarmament and a safer future. He paused. No one recognized the man in the worn jacket, the retired technician who had saved millions without ever asking for thanks. Yet, as he watched the faces filled with hope and fear, he felt a surge of connection. Here were people who feared the power he had once helped keep in check, people who dreamed of a world where weapons like those he once worked on would no longer exist. Harlan's eyes lingered on a young woman holding a simple sign, "Peace is the only real power." The words echoed in his mind, reminding him of something a former defense official once said, words that had haunted and inspired him through the years. "We live on a planet where the threat of nuclear disaster is the ultimate test of our ability to hold peace above fear." William Perry. The irony was not lost on Thomas. Peace, he knew, was never guaranteed by weapons or walls. It was fragile, a delicate balance held by courage, by those willing to stand up even when the cost was personal, by those who refused to stay silent when silence would mean disaster. As he continued walking, the sound of hopeful chants faded behind him, replaced by the quiet hum of everyday life. He didn't look back, because he understood now that his fight wasn't just about one moment, one sabotage, or one secret uncovered. It was part of a larger story, a story of vigilance, sacrifice, and the ongoing effort to keep the world safe, not through fear, but through resolve. The Cold War might be over, but the lessons remained. That sometimes the greatest dangers come not from distant threats, but from inside the walls we trust. That true courage often means standing alone, speaking truth in the face of denial, and choosing what is right over what is easy. And that peace, the most precious gift of all, is always worth the fight. For Thomas Harlan, the battle was never about glory or fame. It was about doing what had to be done, so others could live without fear. And that was a legacy no secret could ever hide. If you're a proud American, and you honor the courage of our national heroes, hit that subscribe button now. This channel brings you powerful true stories of bravery, sacrifice, and the unseen battles that kept our nation safe. Don't miss what comes next.